right. Bible study. Proverbs.
Mix it up.
It's hard for me to resist it. Try it up, friends.
Or you did a few.
All right.
This looks yummy.
Yeah, please do.
I got one on my plate.
We are in Proverbs 10. Good to be back. Everybody is here. People wrapping up. Ghost Town, Labor Day. As the Pennsylvanians would say, we've gone down to the shore. It's funny, speaking to my Philadelphia transferees, even my grandparents, my dad's side in Baltimore County, had a lot of the accent that is in, Philly. Not full like a full Upper Darby accent, but it's very funny, go down to the shore and water and all that sort of thing. Water. Well, yeah, Baltimore. Yeah, and it's the same in the Philly area. It's very mid-Atlantic thing. People forget how diverse America actually is. What? Yeah. Water, ice.
Yeah, water.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a few. My grandfather still said Ewins, because he's from central Pennsylvania. He wasn't a Yinzer, but he was a Ewins. And the other thing is very Irish. You say and declare in a sentence, you flip it up against a question. So you like that cake then? Excellent. These are wonderful little quirks of different regions. Anyway, Proverbs 10. Finally, we start seeing some proper Proverbs. We're actually going into the little sayings, kind of the apple a day keeps the doctor away. Penny saves is penny. By the way, neither of those are in the Proverbs or in the Bible at all. Penny saves, penny here, and I believe Ben Franklin. Poor Richard's Almanac. Oh, yes. All that we've covered was a long charge or discourse from a father/king to a son regarding wisdom in life. There's a really interesting thing about the structure of this book. And what we're going to see, actually, as we go through Solomon's Proverbs, and then more Proverbs that Solomon collected from other sources, is at the end there'll be another discourse of a mother to a son. The structure of the Proverbs is really fascinating because we have Proverbs 31 leading up to all that. So you have Proverbs themselves as kind of the sandwich in the middle, right? There's the bologna of the sandwich, and then the two pieces of bread are the discourses. It's not one giant inclusio, but it is a very similar structure of kind of bookending this whole wonderful book that the Lord has bequeathed upon us. Let's see. Yes, 31 will be. Yes. All right. 10. Let's read verses 1 through 7.
Proverbs of Solomon. A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is the grief of his mother. Treasures of wickedness profit nothing, but righteousness delivers from death. The Lord will not allow the righteous soul to famish, but he casts away the desire of the wicked. He who has a slack hand becomes poor, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. He who gathers in summer is a wise son. He who sleeps in harvest is a son who causes shame. Blessings are on the head of the righteous, but violence covers the mouth of the wicked. The memory of the righteous is blessed, but the name of the wicked will rot.
All right. Again, you have this really. these are all little, like anybody here, if you're new to memorizing Scripture, Proverbs is a really neat way to start. Because they're made to be memorable. They're just little short things. Wise son makes a glad father, a foolish son is having issue with his mother. I can remember that, right? And it's practical. It's useful. It's encouraging. It's interesting. It's inviting. Proverbs is inviting us to actually care about the happiness of our parents, and the honor of our parents. We want to actually honor our parents with how we are, and we want to bring them a degree of happiness and be a blessing to them. This is an extension of the Decalogue. Honor thy father and thy mother. It's interesting. There was a pastor friend of mine who spoke at a secular college campus, and to be provocative, he talked about toxic matriarchy. About toxic patriarchy, and he said there's such a thing as his idea was toxic patriarchy is only the strong survive, and you never protect the weak, and there's no justice, right? I mean, you just you set a survival of the fittest, even for like the weak and those that should be protected, and it's the strong. So that's toxic patriarchy. It's a real thing. It happens in real environments. Toxic matriarchy is a sort of smothering thing that won't allow us to grow up and be independent. And it's kind of a bondage. It causes resentment and bullying because you passively work under the authority to get someone else in trouble rather than dealing with that actual person. Like an adult, right? Work it out. And you can have extremes of each. And his thing was talking about the other extreme you're not allowed to talk about. And you think of all of the chaos regarding sexuality that occurs on the college campus and the ideologies. So he started with, "Are you my mother?" Right? The book. Because that's countercultural now, Really, right? And he started, so he's doing Dr. Seuss reading "Are You My Mother" by, I think it's P.D. James. And then he was talking about the joys of parenthood and the way God has made the natural family, father, mother, children, and then an extended family. And he's like, one of the greatest consolations a woman will ever have is to be a mother. And of course, all the students went, "Boo!" Right? So they started screaming and yelling over it. Right? And he's like, "I'm surprised you're saying that. Don't you think you're a consolation to your mother?" And then, you could have heard a pin drop. Because you are. You're called to be a consolation to your mother and to your father. Sometimes there's no pleasing some people, but there's a real happiness and joy and blessing to be had in being a source of gladness for your parents, to be a source of consolation for them. And then Solomon's saying that. And the way you do that is being wise. Be wise. You make your father and your mother happy. But if you're foolish, they'll just be like, it'll be a source of travail and tribulation. Even if they don't have to pay your debt, so to speak, right? If you're running the speeding tickets, they don't have to pay off the tickets. They're still sad to see you acting that way. Right? It's just not a good way to live life. Next, we have the treasures of wickedness profit nothing, but righteousness delivers from death. Let's put it this way. The return on wickedness is non-existent, right? You're thinking in business terms. There's no profit in wickedness in the long term. There's nothing good that's going to come from it, whereas deliverance from death is found in righteousness. I want you to think of this in gospel terms, in terms of eternality, your eternal life. And also, it does play out in the world. If you're the sort of person who doesn't do people wrong, who does not have malice, you are a good neighbor, you are a good son, you are a good father, guess what? At least you aren't your worst enemy. You won't bring disaster upon yourself. And if the society is in a place where it should be, they'll gather around you. This is actually why I really like the Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life. Right? One of the lessons there is This man who felt like all of life had passed him by, he kept getting the short end of the stick, he kept taking the harder path, and it seemed like no one appreciated it, right? And then he sees the effect, what would have happened if he hadn't been there, if he hadn't been the salt and light in his community, and what would have happened to his wife, what would have happened to the neighborhood, and then the whole neighborhood comes out to support him, right? At the end of the story, everybody collects it and pays off the debt. And it's a beautiful story. It's actually very much what I'm thinking of here. If Mr. Potter, right, the wicked kind of robber baron guy, if he actually needed help, who was going to stand up for him? Not a person. But living a life of virtue and really building that. I mean, man is capable of virtue because he's made in God's image. Even though we're marred up by sin, there's still something there. Even if I might be weak in some area, the rest of you might not, right? And I'll be the outlier, and hopefully I can get more into what I need to be. But it's just very insightful that, that being evil isn't worth it. Being good will be. And it can be very unrewarding at the time in terms of short-term gains. One of the big things is Solomon looks to long-term gains, to have a long perspective on life. The other thing we see, how well will it go for someone who opposes God? Ultimately, right? Very badly. Death. Right? Do you want death in life? I saw a little meme where, the person says, I'm spiritual but not religious, and what that actually means is, I believe God exists, but I won't follow him. That's kind of the sad, that's the way people do live that way in life. And we can live that way too if we're not careful.
I know it's when people aren't interested in the scripture of the Lord here, day-to-day being, and yet when they get ready to face death, oh my goodness, please, I hope I'm going to go to heaven. Well, why would you even want to go when you don't?
Right, you don't like it, or and one of the greatest, privileges was serving folks on their deathbed as they're getting ready to die, and they've been doing a pretty good job of getting ready. And we have some real talk. And there's a moment in the visitation of the sick where it's very clear that you can confess to the priest any really besetting sins you're really ashamed of. And you're worried about when you see the Almighty at your end of days and there's the great white throne and all of that. If you're worried about that being brought up, talk to me. Let's confess that to Christ. Let's lay it on his account. Let's repent. Let's confess and know that God forgives you because of the cross. And most of the time, people don't have anything to say. But the opportunity is given because we need to. This is why I like the hymn this morning, right? Treat today as if it were your last. Or as the Compline service says, the family evening prayer service, live your life in such a way you're never afraid to die. So just part of wisdom is just not pursuing evil. That's actually probably the core of it, is fearing God and eschewing evil. The next thing we see is sloth is dangerous. Sloth brings dishonor as well as poverty. He becomes poor that deals with the slack hand, the diligent shall make rich. He that gathers in summer is a wise son, but he that sleeps in harvest is a son that causes shame. Here's what's interesting, and I've talked about this before. It's one of those keys to appreciating Solomon. A lot of the people reading this book, the original audience, weren't farmers. They were princes in the court. They were living in an urban environment. But they needed the wisdom, the necessary wisdom to prosper, the same virtues. So when you're in summer and you actually are a farmer and the grain's out there, the corn's out there, the boy who wouldn't hoe corn, have you heard that song before? If you don't harvest that squash or those beans, they're going to rot on the vine, right? They'll go bad. and you need to, and you will literally go extinct within the year if you don't gather them in summer. And it's hot in summer. You don't want to, but they're ready, and you need to bring them in to can them, pickle them, cook them, whatever. You need to gather in summer. Well, a farmer knows that already. Literally within a year or two, he'll die. What is being said here? You have rich young men who are not farmers, but they still have work to do. And it needs doing now. And it's not pleasant to do. Right? It's hot out. It's not hot, but it's an unpleasant deed, right? I got to do the paperwork. When I was a scout, and you're working on the Eagle Scout, earning the rank of Eagle, there's actually two halves to it. There's the really arduous, it seems to be the most arduous part, which is the work project where you're building a picnic shelter or whatever, big landscaping thing. And that's the work, getting the manpower, getting resources donated or bought, all of that. Do you know what would happen sometimes? Guys wouldn't earn their Eagles not because they didn't do a project. They'd do all the project, they wouldn't finish the paperwork. Because there's this really long form, this really long paperwork that you had to fill out. It wasn't really long. When you look back at it as an adult, it's like nothing. I mean, we file taxes, right? But back then, right, you're a kid in high school or whatever, they're like, oh, you keep putting it off. Guess what happens? There's a certain date on it where it has to reset. And some guys had to do 2 projects. Other guys would just give up and stay Life Scout forever, because they wouldn't go out and harvest in summer, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? So this is actually talking to people that aren't farmers, but telling them the same thing that your grandpa David needed when he worked on the farm, when he worked with the sheep, right? You need to do, son, even though you live in Jerusalem in a palace, and it has more to do with foreign trade or whatever, you still need to work. You need to put the time in. You need to do it while it needs to get done, right? My grandfather worked on a farm or a factory. I'm not doing either. But I still got to work. And it is work, right? I mean, we all have this. And it's actually encouraging for us because we're in a very similar situation where so much America was farmers. And then very quickly after the World Wars, we stopped being. And we all kind of got different jobs. We still have work, but it's different. And we can put off working and being foolish because there's a lot of money going around right now and a lot of technology. But if you keep doing that, what's going to happen when there's a depression? You're in a lot of trouble, right? When the good times stop rolling, when the cash stops flowing, and there's whatever, some disruption, a famine hits the land, oh no, now you're lazy, and you haven't done any work, and that's what kind of got you into this problem in the first place, and no one's going to hire you, right? Laura, you're smiling.
I'm smiling because most of us, I think, would consider this sort of, not a minor sin, but not a
deadly sin, right? Sloth is one of the deadly sins.
It is one of the deadly sins, but we have this sort of, I just sort of see it in terms because I see so many kids who have no clue how to take care of themselves. And I would say, frankly, people up into their 30s, we're so far removed from having to do things to nourish ourselves. We're so far from not eating unless you get out and get it off of the land.
Right.
But people don't know how to change tires or fix things or all of those functional things that our parents did.
And sometimes didn't teach you, sometimes did teach you. And there's something lost. What's fascinating is how YouTube has functioned, because there are good-hearted souls who show you how to cook, how to change a tire, how to tie a tie. There's even one guy who was an orphan, and one of his things he does is he's like, Dad, how do I? ... question mark. And that's the name of his channel, and it's, Dad, how do I do a job interview? Dad, how do I write a resume? Dad, how do I wash the windows? Dad, how do I wax a car? And because he never had that growing up. And so YouTube is kind of an indictment of some of the problems that have preceded to us. if when the family gets disrupted or the parents don't want to do what they're supposed to do. Yeah, I just remember Dad always calling me out, all right, son, change the oil. And I had to change the oil with Dad. And it wasn't bad. I actually like spending time with my father and getting your hands dirty. It's actually one of the interesting things I found. There's a threshold you have to cross where you're, in a sense, comfortable with dirty hands. With like, oh, I don't have to wash my hands right away. For some reason, we're taught to wash hands all the time. And just being used to having that residue of a mower grass, right? That kind of, just having green fingers or having dirt under your fingers, you're working in the garden, or grease and oil. It's like, yeah, I'll wash that off when I'm done, but all I'll do now is wipe it with a rag, and it's kind of smudgy. It's okay. That's actually an interesting thing. You kind of need that for all of life, I'll take a shower later, and it's not, you don't have to be prissy. I think that's actually translates to all sorts of things, not just handiwork. And you need these virtues. You need virtues that are associated with hard work, manual labor, for things that aren't manual labor. That's what I'm trying to say, right? This saying isn't something a farmer needs to hear. He knows that. It's the guy that works not on a farm that needs to be reminded of what the farmer knows instinctually. Yes, ma'am.
There was one of the most touching things I saw how I ran across it was a guy, a father that was in an iron lung because of polio.
Oh, my. Yeah.
And he was there his life, I guess, and he had a son, and he said, push me over to the window, and I'm going to teach you how to mow the yard. And they had a leaky faucet, and he said, bring me my tool bag, and I'll show you what tell you how to do it. And I thought, whoa.
Right.
So that
Commitment.
was pretty impressive.
You're right. Why doesn't Father Bart go to the car wash or hire other people to mow for him? In the words of Maggie's grandfather, who's very similar to my father, nobody does it to my satisfaction. Why? Because Dad was such, that was, you got to get the yard right, which it's not, but I know that I know what I need to do. And car washing, I don't do as often as I need to. But when everybody else does it, I'm like, you missed it, right? This is what my dad would do, and I'm sure I'm going to pass that on too. But, every family has its differences. Like, what do they cheat on? What do they really want exact? And that's fine. But you need something, right? You need this thing. And it's encouraging because, again, I fret because I don't have the same kind of life my grandfather did. I admired him and what he was. And I'm like, well, I don't have the exact childhood as he did. Will I be okay? And Proverbs seems to think yes. You're different than your grandfather. You're under different circumstances, and guess what? You still need virtue, and you can still have it. You can still practice it. It's just a trickier situation. Sloth is dangerous. It brings dishonor. Dishonor is dangerous when you think about how we are communal social creatures. If you're dishonorable in society, you need society. We all need it. That's a dangerous thing. Poverty just aggravates everything. It's not like you're immoral for being in poverty. If you've been slothful, it's your own fault, though, isn't it? Right? And don't be your own worst enemy. And then poverty is just difficult. It makes life hard. And if you're not in poverty, you can also be a blessing to others as well that are in poverty. Right? And Solomon wants us to be blessings, to have dominion over ourselves, and to also not be in total meltdown panic mode when a hard time comes. All right? The wise woman laughs when winter comes because her children are clothed in warm scarlet. Solomon wants that for all of us. And in avoiding sloth, being diligent is a way to fight against that. History, finally, you look at the last few verses. History is unkind to the violent and wicked. Moreover, they lose standing in the court of public opinion. The memory of the just is blessed, but the name of the wicked shall rot. Right? Blessings are upon the head of the just, but violence covers the mouth of the wicked. I don't know. I want history to be kind to me. I don't let that put me in bondage, but it gives me perspective. That you want to be wise and be honorable, and people think that they will get fame by being really wicked and evil, and you will get fame, but it's not the fame you want. Does that make sense? Right? Hitler got a lot of power, and he made a lot of difference in the world. He was very famous, right? And he accomplished a lot. Not a lot of it was good. That's kind of what Solomon's asking us to think about too. And this is for all of us, even if you're not a chancellor or a premier or whatever, an emperor. We're all called to this. Let's look at verses 8 through 12. Excuse me.
The wise in heart will receive commands, but a prudent fool will fall. He who walks with integrity walks securely, but he who perverts his ways will become known. He who winks with the eye causes trouble, but a prudent fool will fall. The mouth of the righteous is a well of life, but violence covers the mouth of the wicked. Hatred stirs up strife, but love covers all sins.
All right. I think broadly speaking, Proverbs are a little disjointed, right? They're just little sayings, but we're seeing a life of integrity. Put shortly, wise people are obedient, trustworthy, and sober. And what I mean by sober is have a serious mindedness. They're not scornful. They're not all wink, wink, nudge, nudge kinds of behavior and speech. I don't know if you've been around people, and I think a lot of young people struggle with this, where they're in situations where they don't have to snicker or laugh or giggle or make jokes or make funny faces, but just be sober and straightforward and be serious and be sober-minded, be trustworthy. And again, that's they feel like that's tamping down their personality. Right? I'm not funny. I'm not making my peers and colleagues laugh and snicker with me. Right? What's a disrespectful student? What do? They crack inappropriate comments and they try to get all their peers to giggle with them. And that's foolish. A wise person doesn't crave that kind of attention. It's whose attention do you want? It should be the bosses, or the teachers, or the kings, or most importantly of all, God's. The parents, and most importantly, God. The speech of the wise brings life. That's akin to what God does. You're able to be a symbol or an allegory or a metaphor or a picture of God. Right? You're made in the image of God. What's one of the things God does? He speaks and then life comes forth. Well, if you're a wise person, your speech brings life. It's not literally creating life from nothing, but it brings flourishing, happiness, peace, concord, joy, justice, righteousness, right? If people don't know what the rules are, if you're foolish, you're not giving good guidance, you're not adjudicating your household, right, as a father, bringing justice and some order, and here's just desserts, and here's how we're going to do things. If you're not doing that, it's miserable, right? Children do want those rules. They do want the fences. And everybody does. Your wife does. Anybody that's in the house does. They need to be righteous. They need to be just. They need to be predictable, if you can, to bring some life there. The love of wise people fosters unity and concord. That's a good thing. It's a good thing. That's what you want in your home and in your life. You're not the sort of person who just stirs up strife all the time. There are people that just seems to be their addiction. They just always have to have drama in their life and bring the drama everywhere else so they can be the center of attention. That's foolish. And you just kind of need to know that. And if there are people like that in your life, we love them and we care for them, but we also know they're in the category of foolish. Right? And so when they say stupid, mean things to us, it's kind of like, well, they're foolish, so I'm going to take that with a big grain of salt. I'm not going to let them take up all my bandwidth because that's just the way they are. And it's really interesting, mature people are like that. It's like, that's just the way they are. I'm like, oh, that's so mean. And they're like, unidealistic. I'm like, yeah, but that's true. And what they're actually exercising should be some patience, right? You're not putting them in charge. You're not putting the loonies in charge of the asylum. But you also know, listen, this is what we're going to do. It's good for your mental health, if I may say so, right? To understand, listen, this person is being foolish, and I want to bring unity and concord. The fool, on the other hand, enjoys the opposite. He enjoys disobedience that results in failure, shame or lack of trust. Or he doesn't enjoy that, but that's what he gets. Shame or lack of trust. Perception as lacking in gravity and needful seriousness. Right? They're just not a serious person. And that's what people perceive them to be. And exacerbating situations to foster division and violence. It's the person who makes situations worse. Constantly. People don't want that sort of person around, right? And that means you're not going to be the person exercising dominion. Does that make sense? Okay. Let's look at verses 13 through 17.
Wisdom is found on the lips of him who has understanding, but a rod is for the back of him who is devoid of understanding. Wise people store up knowledge, but the mouth of the foolish is near destruction. The rich man's wealth is his strong city. The destruction of the poor is their poverty. The labor of the righteous leads to life, the wages of the wicked to sin. He who keeps instruction is in the way of life, but he who refuses correction goes astray.
Let's talk about wise men and the valuing of knowledge. Right? That's kind of the broader theme in these Proverbs. I think the first thing to say is foolishness is painful. It results in self-inflicted misery and chastisement from authorities. Right? If you're the guy who just refuses to be competent, you have a lot of misery because if an authority is in any way responsible, there's going to be some sort of consequences for your foolishness. Sorry, but not that sorry. I mean, they would be remiss if they didn't do that. And so there's a rod at your back for foolishness. You're your own worst enemy. Again, this is a very common thing, and I think for all of us, I know I speak for myself where that's been my own experience, unfortunately. Right, where I often find myself in pickles because I've been my own worst enemy, because I've been foolish. Wise people value knowledge. They seek it out and they store it up like treasure, because that is what it is. It is much more valuable than money, property, etc. True, and I'm thinking especially of true knowledge, true wisdom. You don't have to be good at like all the skill sets or all the fields of knowledge you would learn at a college or a university. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about really knowledge of life, knowledge of human existence, knowledge of God, and where we stand with God and how we proceed and walk with Him. You could be illiterate. You could be very foolish, even naive, like politically speaking, socially speaking, whatever. But if you're able to persevere and endure the loss of a dear loved one, and maintain holiness and a right perspective in the midst of tremendous suffering like that, that's more important. Like, I won't look to you for like tax law policy ideas. Okay, but you have the most important things with regard to life in order. And all wise people, right? They don't have the same academic interests in common, but they do have in common the interest in the things of God and of our life and holiness and virtue and wisdom, right? That's actually brings us together. That's what's really cool about being a church. Right? We have a pretty, even before our size, we have a very diverse congregation. lots of walks of life, lots of interests. But we all share in common a desire to attend to the Word of God, which is His wisdom. We're not all there yet, for sure, but we should all be oriented around hearing God, hearing His wisdom as found in His Word, fearing God together. That's what I'm talking about. And wise people value that. Right? They make the time in terms of Bible study. They make the time in terms of what are they thinking about. And this is where the enemy's dangerous, because he used to distract us with anything but that stuff. Right? Noise. Screwtape Letters is, again, really good with this. You got to distract the patient, because once he even starts thinking about anything worthwhile, he's in the enemy, God's hands, right? Becky, you have your hand raised up.
Yeah. A long time ago, I read the life story of Corrie ten Boom.
Oh, yeah.
And her father read the Bible to the family every day at breakfast.
Right.
And when you think of how she endured and was victorious in that concentration camp,
right,
all of that wisdom and the presence of God was there to give her strength, endurance, and even enable her to bless others.
Yes.
Because she was filled with the wisdom of God through daily Bible reading.
Right.
And her father's example was even better than if she had read it by herself.
Right. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. And wise people, I think, very often just have interests for things outside themselves. They'll often have hobbies or careers or whatever, and or just an emotional depth and just interest in something else outside themselves. The fool very often is wrapped up inside himself, and he thinks he has all that he needs within inside himself. Oh, there's a cultural script. You have everything you need within yourself. What a script for foolishness, right? Because I often think wise people are like, whether it's literature or history or local history or gardening, I find wise people in gardening. Sometimes they're foolish in other things. Woodworking, metalworking, whatever. They get just sewing, knitting, crocheting, crafts. What's that English dance thing with the jingling bells? Celtic dance, whatever. They're just interested in stuff that's out there because they know it's a beautiful, interesting world. There's a lot of interesting things in it. They can participate in it, and they don't look deep within themselves all the time. It's just all sorts. But that's often the habit of seeking something. You understand there's stuff for you to learn. You're deficient. You don't come into the world full-orbed and Einstein. And you don't plan to leave the world in the same condition. You'll go naked, just like you came in, just like the Bible says. But on the other hand, you can learn stuff, including the most important things. That's all I'm kind of talking about. And I think, again, that's a cultural script we have to fight against. You are an island entire to yourself, and everything you need is within you, and you need to look within. And that isn't a recipe for wisdom. Now, it is good to listen to your conscience, because God does give you something to help you govern, has some intuition to help you govern situations of morality. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying people relying upon themselves and not seeking to learn. It's not seeking to know God better and be known by Him better. That's foolish.
Yeah, that's sort of the definition of idolatry.
Oh, yes. And what does the Bible say? Idolaters, people who make idols, what do they become like? The thing they make. They become a deaf, dumb, blind statue. They become like them, even as they bow down and worship to them. The great irony. They put so much genius into it. A craftsman cutting wood and making it representative, covering it in silver and gold, and maybe putting jewels on it. The Bible talks about it. There's all the skill there that God made. And then you set that up to worship it. You just built it. You're worshiping a thing that you built. We do it all the time. But and the foolishness of that. You're the creator in that situation. And the creator bows down to worship the creature. And how inverted is that? And then you become stupid because of everything that falls out, because you have refused to acknowledge the real source of wisdom, right? The actual creator of us all, right? God made this world. Do you think he's pretty smart? Why don't you take your nature documentary and ask? Wisdom is the most valuable thing, and it's something they can't take away from you, right? The stock market goes up and down. Businesses, the price of wheat or whatever can totally blow out your business out of the water. But the actual thing of how you live a wise life, it's not affected by any of that. Now, it causes you to act differently in the midst of it, especially compared to fools, when the tongue going gets rough. But it's not something that you can lose unless you decide to neglect it, not keep thinking, not meditating, that sort of thing. Does that make sense?
I say call summed up in Psalm 1.
Right.
All of it.
It's the wisdom of planting by the river of life and being a tree.
Yes.
I think Daniel does Nebuchadnezzar an honor when he calls him a tree, because he is a great king. He's not the best good king, but because of what he's brought in terms of order to the land, he's better than the Assyrians. Birds nest in the tree, animals graze and have shade, and Psalm 1 invites the righteous man to be a tree, to be a place of life. A whole ecosystem can come to a tree if a tree grows and plants itself by a river, as a water source. And that's what we're called to be, and that's what Christ is. He dies on the tree. He is the tree of life and the knowledge of good and evil, right? The source of wisdom. And if we're grafted onto the tree, onto the vine as branches, to grow and to flourish, to bring forth fruit of the Spirit. And we're called to be trees, connecting heaven and earth, because our goal, our job is a mediatorial one, as a priest. We're all priests, bringing up creation and praise to God, and also proclaiming God's glories and goodness to the creation. Do you see that? We all have a mediatory role. We are both physical, material, and we have the spirit, soulish part, the intelligence part. And God made us that way. And that's why we are going to be the ones we are, because Christ is human. He's the one ruling it. Right? Christ is wise, and he valued knowledge, didn't he? He valued wisdom. Poverty is hard. Wealth has its uses. I think that's just simple. I don't think, as you get older, you start becoming more aware of this, right? If you get the nail in your tire, your whole monthly budget isn't thrown to absolute chaos if you have some sort of emergency fund, right? And unfortunately, what's around us in culture is what? Live hand to mouth, month to month, outside your means. So much so that when you do get that flat tire, it is a source of distress. And then what if you lose your job? There's a big job loss in the market, nobody's hiring. Right? And have nothing. No runway. Right? Out of it's constraining, it's difficult, it makes your life miserable, and it doesn't need to be if you had been frugal, for example, or hardworking and doing that. Wealth has uses with regard to persevering through storms of life, particularly of a financial nature. Having real wealth rather than a luxurious lifestyle will be of immense benefit when a season of hardship hits the land. Do you see what I'm saying there? I think a lot of Americans live a luxurious lifestyle. And that can deceive us and the actual facts on the ground of real financial health. Yes, ma'am.
This goes back to sloth, actually.
Yes, it does, yes.
We live a luxurious lifestyle because we live in instant gratification.
And what do we do to get the luxury? Yeah, so you want to get instant gratification. There's a lot of products out there. You want them immediately. What do you do to get it in our culture?
Anything.
But what's the common path? And it seems to be debt.
Yeah.
That you shouldn't even take on.
Or steal it from somebody else.
Or steal it from somebody else. Or my hypothetical career opportunities that we have destroyed because I committed fornication and now have brought a child into the world, and that child threatens my financial future. What am I going to do with it? And the father will have the same thing. I don't want obligations of parental father support with that. What do? We kill the child. Because we wouldn't be responsible. It's amazing saying the activist is like, well, if Texas is going to do this, women should withhold themselves from men unless the men are committed to child support, generous child support, et cetera, et cetera. Like, you've just reinvented marriage. Yeah, how about we write it down where he endows you with all his earthly goods. You all become one thing, you share that all in one name, so if he dies, you inherit. If you die, he inherits, and he commits to raising the children with you, any children that come along. And before we do the child-making activity, we'll commit to that first. And that's like, ta-da, you've reinvented marriage. It's just, we're coming around full circle. It's like, and it's so funny because it's supposed to be like, we're going to do this, we're going to go on strike until you do this. And I'm like, your terms are acceptable. That's what all the Christians are like, your terms are acceptable, let's do that. But, it's foolishness. It's the cycle of foolishness. And it's, see how it's hand in hand with immorality? Right? The financial foolishness is also inclining us to sexual immorality and even murder. And they're both in kind of a mutual dependent relationship that hurts our whole culture. Right? It hurts people. It's bad for people. People are dying, and then the people that do the deed, that affects your soul. That affects all of us spiritually. And it affects how we see people. Right? If you're a possible threat to my well-being, even flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone, that's not a very humane society, is it? Right? You're a threat to me. There's only so much of the pie, so I'm going to get 3 slices before we run out. That sort of idea. That's not... the whole kingdom suffers. The whole realm suffers under this. And it is. It really is. What sort of wages do you seek? That's the final section here. Putting a New Testament inflection, right? What are the wages of your sloth? The rich man's wealth is, let's see, verse 16, the labor of the righteous tends to life, the fruit of the wicked man to sin. He is in the way of life that keeps instruction, but he that refuses reproof erreth. Isn't that interesting? What kind of wages do you want to make in this life? What does Paul say? The wages of sin is death, right? Do you want that wage? Nope. Pursue wisdom, pursue righteousness. That's a good wage. To be foolish is to be lost and on the road to destruction. Verses 18 through 21.
Whoever hides hatred has lying lips, and whoever spreads slander is a fool. The multitude of words, sin is not lacking, but he who restrains his lips is wise. The tongue of the righteous is choice silver. The heart of the wicked is worth little. The lips of the righteous feed many, but fools die for lack of wisdom.
All right. We'll proceed from there, but it's starting to transition into the next section. But we'll stop there. Gossips.
Or did you?
No. That'll be the next section. Gossips, seditious plotters, and duplicitous folks who know of an evil that needs reporting but don't report it are liars and fools. Let's look at that. He that hides hatred with lying lips. That's an sin of omission, right? If there's something that needs to be reported and brought to light and brought to justice, and you hide it, and he that utters the slander, so that's a commission. You're saying something false to harm someone else, right? Slandering somebody. Both of those, so there's omission and commission, are foolish. How are contemporary Americans, including American Christians, doing on this front? And why? What am I talking about here? I don't know if you could read between some of the lines.
I was thinking of Washington, D.C. when you read that verse.
Yeah.
And how much deception and self...
and the distrust of the public,
Yes.
which causes us to fray at the seams.
Yes.
So
Yes.
you're seeing the dysfunction around us was like, well, I don't even trust this person, so I'm not going to do what they say.
And some people don't even vote anymore.
Right, because they just don't feel, yeah.
There's no one worth voting for in their minds.
Yeah, and what else? I think there's been recently, unveiling of high-profile scandals within the church, scandals of abuse and all sorts of terrible things that a lot of people just shut up about. They knew about it, but they didn't report it, and they didn't do anything about it. Why?
Save their own skins.
Save their own skins? What else?
Possible promotion.
Possible promotion, right? I see the short-term gain to be had from this. We've got this machine, right? We've got a church that's getting lots of butts and seats. That's our definition of a success. And by the way, that pays the bills, right? There's not all people are saying that out loud, but, the heart has a lot of complexity. Maybe it's not all that serious. I won't look into it. I won't ask. I'll just ask them briefly, and I'll take their word. The one being accused, and not really, kind of pursuing that aggressively like you need to, right? If what's happening is happening, it's very serious. The person will probably lie if they're doing what they're saying they're going to do. They'll aggressively try to deceive and get out of any consequence. And they also, if they're the figurehead, so to speak, that bring in the people, you've got to protect him because it's all based on his personality and his ego and his charisma. So you're killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. Right? This is the scary thing, right? I like being here. I think, I have a role here to play. But if I were to, in some way, do something scandalous so as to invalidate my ministry and I get defrocked, it's not going to be the end of the world. There are other priests and deacons out there that will take my office. The idea that I see it as an office that I am utterly irreplaceable for, I'll die and be buried in a yard, under the ground somewhere, and I will be fine. Some other man will hopefully proclaim the gospel faithfully, and then somebody after him, right? It really lowers the stakes in a good way, because I'm not the moneymaker. I'm not the goose. I'm not the goose that lays the golden eggs. That's not our model here. And there's a temptation to not report on that which needs to be reported and redressed, and the unpleasantness of accountability that a lot of American Christians just aren't going to do, unfortunately. And then what happens? In a decade or two, it's just Hiroshima. It's just, and then the name of Christ is blasphemed because of our unfaithfulness. And it is being. There's a lot of scoffing of the church that is unfortunately well-deserved. Because of this, we hide the evil. Likewise, slandering people when it's cheap and easy. That's something very easy to do on Twitter, including Christians. Christians falsely accusing other Christians without any real evidence and just gossiping. That happens very easily on Twitter, right? It's very easy to just write 140 words now, or 280, whatever, shoot it off on the internet, and you think you're kind of anonymous, but until you aren't, and then you suddenly are ducking and hiding. It's just foolish. It's foolish. All of it is foolish because you're thinking in short term. I'm going to kick this guy when he's down, and people will think I'm funny and smart and righteous for it. That's kind of the slander thing. Or I'll hide this because it'll blow over in the end, and I'll be out of Dodge by then anyway. And surely it's not actually happening. And so I don't want to slog through the process of bringing accountability because it is unpleasant. And then people will get mad at you for doing it. How dare you attack this faithful man of God or woman of God or whatever? How dare you? It's like, because I need to. Because he's fleecing the flock. He's abusing the weak. She's teaching error. She's stirring up discord. any sort of discipline, stuff like that. And, the foolishness in the short term seems like a good idea, but when you think long term, particularly when you stand before the judgment seat of God, it's suddenly the long term brings it, changes the perspective, a wiser perspective. Does that make sense? Okay. Inflation of words and their value. Proverbs is all about this, but whose speech matters most? The blabbermouths or those that hold their tongue? We'll see later that the praise of flatterers is particularly worthless. There was also a post I saw recently, a nurse saying the same people that at the start of the pandemic called them all heroes. Honk your horn, heroes live here. I'm very appreciative of healthcare workers and all the grief they've had to endure. But people that do that cheaply and easily are just the ones that will take it away just as quickly and treat you like garbage. And that's what she was complaining about. That's how the healthcare system was actually treating them like garbage. It's like, yeah, those that give it cheaply will take it easily as well, unfortunately. The same thing about, how currency works. A lot of it, and inflation of it, makes it less valuable. And so in the multiplicity of words, multitude of words, first of all, if you're speaking all the time, you're going to get yourself in all kinds of trouble because you're going to say foolishness sometime if you're talking all the time. Yeah, that's 4 fingers pointing back at me.
I was going to say, it's pretty providential I read that part, so I'm sorry.
No, and this is so, right? Because when you talk, people can listen to you and you like the attention. It's a pride thing. And that is, first of all, it makes your other words, especially if you are given to exaggeration or other sorts of things or lies, it's not going to be worth much. It's just noise to a lot of people. And you'll often get yourself in trouble. You'll screw up sometime because you're doing it so much. Right? Eventually you're going to mess up, and that'll get you in trouble. And those are 2 things that Solomon just reminds us of, right? Don't be the blabbermouth. And if that's what you're given to, learn to sit quietly and realize there's wisdom outside yourself.
It's better to be thought of as a fool than open your mouth and remove all doubt.
And that is very biblical. And you're basically gonna see that exact teaching in Proverbs. It's like and pretty much that's what you find. Is you bring condemnation upon yourself. Don't confirm. Even if you are foolish, you can be beneficially mistaken as wise if you just shut up. And that will get you through a lot of issues. People will say, why were you silent in the face of that? It's like I had nothing to say. Nothing I would have said would have. I don't think well on my feet, and just shutting up and thinking about it later and maybe coming up with something later is helpful. Again, with our instant gratification, I want to hear it now. I want to zip right. That's what talking heads are. Who gets invited to the news program? Those that can think of something very slick, really quick off the cuff. They're very funny, but they're often not the sort of people I want to actually be wise, judicious, patient, thoughtful, leading the country on issues of policy and so forth. They're provocateurs. They are sophists. They are gadflies. They don't have much to offer. They don't have much to offer. And that's why I like someone who does the work and really is patient. And often they'll be the ones quiet. And then you can find, sometimes it depends on the situation. They'll say it. It's like, oh, he's into the discussion. Right? Or you actually pry it out of him. It's like, oh, that was the answer. That sort of thing. And that's you got to get attuned to that. And we all have to do that. Let's try to finish up. Oh my goodness, we're around the edge. 22 through 32.
The blessing of the Lord makes rich. He adds no sorrow with it. Doing wrong is like a joke to a fool, but wisdom's pleasure to a man of mercy. What the wicked dreads will come upon him. The desire of the righteous will be granted. When the tempest passes, the wicked is no more, but the righteous is established forever. Like vinegar to the teeth and smoke to the eyes, so is the sluggard to those who send him. The fear of the Lord prolongs life, but the years of the wicked will be short. Lord is a stronghold to the blameless, but destruction to the evildoers. The righteous will never be removed, but the wicked will not dwell in the land. The mouth of the righteous brings forth wisdom, but the perverse tongue will be cut off. The lips of the righteous know what is acceptable, but the mouth of the wicked what is perverse.
I'm going to be very fast to go through this. First of all, look at that verse 22. God's blessings are pure and potent. Like pure goodness, nothing lacking, no fly in the ointment. We also see, basically, this whole long set of Proverbs, the interplay of desires, fear, and either temporality or eternity. The wise has his eye toward the eternal. The fool, again, very short-term thinking, very temporal thinking. The wise, they're radically different, right? The interplay, the desires, the fears, and the perspective, like the chronological perspective of the wise and the foolish are radically different. What does the fool fear? What does he desire versus what does a wise person worry about? What does he desire? Next, go to the very practical lesson. Those in authority resent lazy underlings. This is very practical. They are a pain. When you're the underling, be diligent. When you're the authority, don't hire, but rather fire the slothful. They will fail you and others in the clutch. How to exercise dominion. First of all, be a good servant, be a humble servant, be diligent in what you're given. And then if you are exalted and lifted up, if things are what they should be, then when you're in charge, you have to make the hard and pleasant decision to fire the slothful. Because what if there's a crisis in the kingdom? You have an nincompoop at the helm of something, and now the whole kingdom suffers because you were too indulgent. Smoke to the eyes, vinegar to the teeth. And it's kind of interesting because if we were made to be servants of God who will also exercise dominion on God's behalf, isn't this what we are to God if we're foolish versus wise? If we're lazy, what is that like to God? It's like smoke to his eyes and vinegar to his teeth. If we're diligent and faithful and humble servants, that's a blessing, right? If God's the boss of all, right, the biggest boss, the greatest authority, we want to be, right, the good servant that isn't smoke to the eyes and vinegar to the teeth, but rather a blessing to him. And again, those who are faithful down below, it's like we sang in our opening hymn, steward your talent well. Right? The talents, the servants and the talents, that parable. Finally, long life is bestowed upon the righteous. That's Torah language. That's Pentateuch language. That's obey your father and mother, honor your father and mother, because you'll live long in the land. Right? We need to see this as with a Christological or resurrection lens. Who will inherit the earth to sit to proclaim judgment upon angels? The saints. The faithful saints. That's what Revelation taught us. That's what the Gospels teach us. We will inherit the earth in Christ. It's all because of Christ, actually, right? So he's the Son of Man. He's the ideal son. He's the ideal servant. And if we're a part of him, we get in on the action, so to speak. He actually transforms us to be little underlings under him, like him, which is good. Again, bringing the New Testament to this. This is where I wanted to finish. I think we're okay. Any questions or thoughts? Love Proverbs. Great. Again, if you want to memorize, good memorization. That last section was very good for memorization, I thought. All right, let's pray. Father, we thank you for your wisdom as found in your word and as practiced by your Son and given to us by your Spirit. We ask that we have ears and eyes and tongues ready to seek out and exercise wisdom. In Christ's name, amen.